My girlfriend's parents tortured me and called me a fake human all because of my prosthetic leg, but then they found out how I lost my real leg, and now they won't even look me in the eye. I adjusted my prosthetic and rang the doorbell at Grace's parents' house, hoping they wouldn't write me off as not good enough just because of my fake leg. Her father Robert opened the door, and his eyes went straight to where my left leg should be, his face shifting to obvious disgust. Her mother Janet appeared behind him and actually recoiled when she saw my cane, stepping back like disability was contagious. Grace squeezed my hand, but Robert was already blocking the doorway sarcastically, asking if they needed to install a ramp like they were running a nursing home. Janet ushered us into the living room, where they'd removed all the comfortable chairs, leaving only a deep couch I'd struggle to get out of. Robert commented, "We were hoping Grace learned her lesson after her last ex, but apparently she has a type. Broken things she thinks she can fix." Grace's face went red, but before she could respond, Janet asked what I did for work. When I mentioned my disability benefits while I was in vocational training, Robert laughed, saying, "So you're a welfare queen. Our daughter is dating someone who steals our tax dollars to sit at home." Janet added that her hairdresser's son lost both legs and still managed to run a business, so what was my excuse for being a parasite? When Grace started to explain, I touched her arm and quietly said, "Let's just change the subject, it's fine," because I didn't want to get into the story about the IED. During dinner, Janet served everyone except me, saying she assumed I had someone who fed me at home. Robert cut my meat without asking, then moved my plate closer like I was a toddler in a high chair, narrating each action slowly and loudly. When I reached for my water, he grabbed my wrist and said, "Careful, that's crystal. Probably costs more than your monthly government check." Then turned to Grace and asked if she really wanted to spend her life as a caregiver. Robert started describing his friend's daughter, who'd married a man in a wheelchair, and how she'd become dead inside from the constant burden. Janet nodded vigorously, adding that Grace would end up changing his diapers by 40. And did she really want to waste her youth on someone who probably couldn't even get it up anymore? Then Janet leaned over and grabbed my face, turning it toward the light and examining me like livestock, saying my skin looked gray and asking if I had some terminal illness they should know about. Robert said, "Grace, remember when Princess Diana did charity work with landmine victims? That was nice of her, but she didn't take them home." When Grace told them to stop, Janet said she was being realistic about what happens when the novelty of playing nurse wears off and you're stuck with dead weight. Robert asked point blank how I'd lost my leg, and before I could deflect, he said, "Probably drunk driving or something equally stupid that you don't want to admit." I just said it was complicated and I'd rather not discuss it, while Janet speculated loudly that it was probably a drug deal gone wrong. She actually pulled Grace into the kitchen where I could still hear her saying, "He's going to be in a wheelchair within 5 years, then dead by 50, and you'll have wasted your best years." I struggled to stand up from the couch, and Robert filmed me with his phone, saying he was documenting what Grace would deal with every day. Janet returned and dumped my cane in the trash, saying, "Oops, thought that was garbage like everything else you brought into our home." Robert grabbed my prosthetic leg through my pants and yanked on it, asking if it was even real. He said, "Grace, sweetheart, you could have any man you want. Why are you settling for 3/4 of a person?" Janet added that she'd rather Grace be a lesbian. At least then they could lie to their friends about who she's dating. That's when the front door opened and someone called out, "Sorry, I'm late." A young man in his 20s walked into the dining room and stopped dead when he saw me. I recognized Ethan instantly, and my whole body started shaking. Me and Ethan had served in Iran together. "Oh my God," he whispered, his tears already falling. "This is him. This is the man who saved my life." He turned to his parents. "How did you find him? Did you invite him over to thank him personally?" He started explaining that I was the lieutenant who went back into the kill zone after the IED tore my leg off to save the lives of my brothers. I was the hero from the story he'd told them 1,000 times. Robert's phone crashed to the floor while Janet's hand flew to her mouth. "Have they been treating you well?" Ethan asked me in regards to his parents. I stared at Ethan for what felt like forever, while Robert's phone stayed on the floor and Janet's hand stayed frozen at her mouth. My throat felt tight, and I couldn't make words come out. Grace's hand gripped mine harder, and she stood up from the couch. "They've been treating him like garbage," she said, her voice shaking. She pointed at the trash can where my cane stuck out. "Your mom threw his cane in there and called it garbage." Her face turned red as she kept going. "Your dad grabbed his prosthetic leg through his pants and yanked on it." She was crying now, but kept talking. "They called him 3/4 of a person and said I should be ashamed of dating him." Ethan's eyes went wide, and he turned to look at his parents. His mouth opened and closed like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. He looked back at me, then at his parents again. "Is this true?" His voice cracked when he asked it. Robert started to say something but stopped. Janet's hand finally dropped from her mouth. "Mom, Dad, is this true?" Ethan asked louder this time. "Did you really do these things to him?" His whole body was shaking now. "This man lost his leg saving my life and you treated him like this?" I pushed myself up from the deep couch, my good leg doing most of the work. My hands were shaking as I reached for the trash can and pulled out my cane. The metal was cold and had food stuck to it from being in the garbage. I wiped it on my pants and leaned on it. "I need to go," I said quietly. Robert opened his mouth to speak, but Ethan put his hand up to stop him. I started walking toward the door, trying to keep my head up even though my whole body felt heavy. Grace grabbed her purse and followed me. My prosthetic made its usual clicking sound against the hardwood floor. Behind us, I heard Ethan's voice getting louder, but I couldn't make out the words. The front door felt heavier than before when I pulled it open. The cool air hit my face, and I took a deep breath. My hands were still shaking as I made my way down the front steps, gripping the railing tight. Grace's car was parked in the driveway, and I headed for it. Footsteps ran up behind me, and I turned to see Ethan coming after us. His face was red and tears ran down his cheeks. "Wait, please wait," he said. He stopped in front of me and wiped his face with his sleeve. "I'm so sorry about my parents." His voice broke again. "I can't believe they did this to you after everything." He grabbed my shoulders gently. "You saved my life and they treated you like that." He was crying harder now. "I owe you everything and they..." He couldn't finish the sentence. "Is there anything I can do?" he asked. "Anything at all to make this right?" I shook my head because there wasn't really anything he could do. "It's not your fault," I told him. He hugged me then, careful not to knock me off balance. "I'm going to talk to them," he said when he pulled back. "This isn't okay." Grace had already started the car, and I got in the passenger seat. Ethan stood in the driveway watching as we pulled away. Grace drove without saying anything for a long time. Her knuckles were white from gripping the steering wheel so hard. We hit a red light, and she finally broke down. Tears streamed down her face, and her shoulders shook. "I'm so ashamed," she said between sobs. "They're my parents, and they did that to you." She hit the steering wheel with her palm. How could they be so cruel? The light turned green, but she didn't move right away. A car behind us honked, and she drove forward, still crying. "I don't know how to process this," she said. "They've always been difficult, but this was something else." She pulled into a parking lot and stopped the car. "I'm so sorry," she kept saying over and over. We sat there for 20 minutes while she cried. When we finally got home, I went straight to the bathroom and sat on the edge of the tub. My hands were still shaking as I rolled up my pant leg to check my prosthetic. The socket felt loose from Robert yanking on it, and I had to readjust the straps. That night, the phantom pain hit hard. It always got worse when I was stressed, but this was bad even for me. The missing part of my leg burned and ached like it was still there, getting blown apart. I kept seeing the IED flash in my mind, mixed with Robert's face when he grabbed my prosthetic. Janet's voice saying I was 3/4 of a person played on repeat in my head. I got up 3 times to take more pain meds, but they barely helped. Grace found me on the couch at 4 in the morning with ice packs on my residual limb. She sat next to me and rubbed my back but didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say. When the sun came up, she made coffee and brought me a cup. Her phone buzzed and she looked at it. Her face got red again as she read whatever was on the screen. "It's from my parents," she said. She turned the phone so I could see the message. It said they were just being protective parents and looking out for her best interests. They said I should understand their position since any parent would have concerns. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of what they'd done. Grace threw her phone on the coffee table. "They don't even think they did anything wrong," she said. She picked up the phone again and started typing fast. "I'm telling them they're not allowed to contact us until they give a real apology." I touched her arm to stop her. "We need to talk about boundaries first," I said. "Real boundaries that we both agree on." She put the phone down and nodded. "You're right," she said. "What do you need?" I thought about it for a minute. "No surprise visits," I said. "No showing up without permission." She nodded and waited for me to continue. "No forced interactions where I have to see them," I said. "And absolutely no physical contact ever again." She grabbed a notebook and started writing it down. "I'll send this to them today," she said. "These are non-negotiable." She kept writing, adding her own boundaries to the list. "I need to call the VA," I said. "I need to see my therapist soon." Grace handed me my phone and I found the number. The receptionist said they could fit me in for an emergency session later that week. I took the appointment and hung up. My leg still hurt, and I knew this was going to take time to work through. 2 days later, my phone rang while I was adjusting my prosthetic socket for the 3rd time that morning. Baxter's name showed on the screen, and I picked up knowing he'd want an update on my job prep. He asked how the practice questions were going, and I told him I was still on track despite some personal stuff happening. He reminded me the interview was in 2 weeks, and we'd scheduled another mock session for Thursday. After hanging up, I saw a text from Ethan asking if we could meet just the two of us to talk. My hands got sweaty looking at his message, but I typed back suggesting the coffee shop on Main Street at 2 o'clock. He agreed immediately, and I spent the next hour pacing my apartment and checking my prosthetic straps over and over. At the coffee shop, I picked a table near the exit and kept my cane within easy reach while waiting. Ethan walked in 5 minutes late, looking tired and older than when I'd last seen him at dinner. He sat down and ordered black coffee, then stared at his hands for a full minute before speaking. He told me his parents had always been scared of him coming home disabled after his deployment. He said they'd seen what happened to their neighbor's son, who came back in a wheelchair, and it made them paranoid about disability. He was clear their fear didn't excuse what they did to me, but wanted me to understand where it came from. We sat there for 40 minutes while he talked about growing up with parents who treated his military service like a death sentence waiting to happen. When I got home, I had 3 missed calls from the VA about my emergency therapy appointment being moved up to tomorrow. The next morning, I drove to the VA hospital and signed in at the mental health desk 20 minutes early. Sophia called me back right on time, and we sat in her small office with the fake plant and motivational posters. She asked me to describe what happened at dinner, and I went through every detail from the trash can to Robert grabbing my leg. She stopped me several times to ask how my body felt during specific moments, and I realized my shoulders were up near my ears, just remembering it. She explained that their treatment was assault and had nothing to do with my worth as a person. We spent the rest of the session working on breathing exercises, and she taught me a grounding technique using my 5 senses. That evening, Grace showed up at my door with a duffel bag and red eyes from crying. She came in and dropped the bag by the couch, then sat down and pulled her knees up to her chest. We needed to figure out if our relationship could handle her parents and what boundaries we both needed. She started listing everything we'd need to address, from holiday visits to potential future kids and how to protect them. I wrote notes while she talked, and we filled 3 pages with boundary requirements and deal breakers. My phone buzzed with another text from Ethan saying he'd confronted his parents again that afternoon. He said they kept calling me a hero, but wouldn't admit they'd personally hurt me as an individual human being. He was frustrated because they acted like my military service canceled out their cruelty rather than making it worse. 2 days later, I sat in Baxter's office for our mock interview, wearing my only suit that still fit. He started with basic questions about my work history, and everything was fine until he asked about the gap in employment. My chest got tight, and I couldn't get enough air even though I was breathing fast. Baxter stopped the interview and got me water while I bent forward trying not to pass out. He rescheduled for next week and suggested I talk to Sophia about interview anxiety strategies. That night, Grace showed me an email from her dad that was supposed to be an apology. Robert spent 3 paragraphs talking about how hard it was for parents to watch their daughter date someone disabled. He mentioned his fears about Grace becoming a caregiver and how that wasn't the life he'd imagined for her. There was one sentence saying he shouldn't have grabbed my prosthetic, but then immediately added that I should understand his protective instincts. I deleted it without responding, and Grace didn't argue with my decision. At my next session with Sophia, we worked on writing a boundary letter to Robert and Janet. She helped me list specific requirements, including no physical contact, no comments about my disability, and no speculation about my life expectancy. We added that any future relationship would require a genuine apology, acknowledging the harm they caused. The letter took 2 hours to write, and Sophia made me practice reading it out loud 3 times. Grace decided she needed space from her parents to figure out her own feelings about everything. She brought 2 more bags over, and we tried living together full-time for the first time. The first week was harder than expected, with both of us trying to navigate sharing space while processing trauma. She reorganized my kitchen without asking, and I got upset because I'd arranged everything to be accessible from my height when using my cane. We had our first real fight about it, and she cried, saying she was just trying to help. I explained that help without asking wasn't actually helpful, and she started understanding how her parents' assumptions about my needs connected to their cruelty. After 2 weeks of living together, we found a rhythm, but the stress showed in small ways. Grace jumped whenever her phone rang, and I started having more phantom pain from the constant tension. She helped me with my prosthetic maintenance one night, something I'd always done alone because it felt too vulnerable. Her hands were gentle as she helped clean the socket and check for pressure sores on my residual limb. Neither of us talked about how this was exactly what her parents said she'd end up doing, but we both thought it. The next morning, Grace's phone started buzzing with texts from her aunt asking why she wasn't at Sunday dinner. Then her cousin called wanting to know if the rumors about her dating someone in a wheelchair were true. Grace put the phone on speaker while making breakfast, and I could hear her uncle in the background saying something about me probably being a drug addict. Her grandmother left 3 voicemails crying about how Grace was breaking the family apart over some man nobody knew. Grace deleted each message without listening to the end, and her hands shook as she cracked eggs into the pan. More relatives kept calling throughout the day, asking if Grace needed help getting away from me or offering to stage an intervention. Her cousin posted on social media asking for prayers for their family during this difficult time, which got dozens of comments from people we'd never met. Grace finally turned off her phone after her aunt texted that she was being selfish for choosing a stranger over blood. 2 days later, I went to my veteran support group at the VA and decided to share what happened at dinner for the first time. The room had 12 other vets sitting in the circle, and when I described Robert grabbing my prosthetic, everyone got quiet. One guy who lost both arms in Afghanistan said civilians treat him like a circus act every day. Another vet talked about his wife's parents refusing to let him in their house because they thought PTSD made him dangerous. The group leader, a Marine who uses a wheelchair, said people thank him for his service, then cross the street to avoid him. Everyone nodded when I mentioned feeling like less than human, and several guys shared similar stories about being called parasites for using VA benefits. After group, Ethan texted me a photo from our deployment showing our whole unit before the attack. I stared at it for 20 minutes, remembering everyone's faces, including the 3 who didn't make it home. That night, I showed Grace the photo and pointed to where the Humvee had been when the IED went off. I explained how the blast threw me 15 feet, and when I tried to stand up, my left leg was just gone below the knee. Blood was pumping out so fast I could see it spraying in the dirt, but I could still hear Ethan screaming from inside the burning vehicle. I dragged myself back using my rifle as a crutch, while my femoral artery painted everything red. The medic said later, I should have bled out in 90 seconds, but somehow I pulled Ethan and 2 others out before collapsing. Grace held my hand, while tears ran down her face, and I described the helicopter ride where they kept pumping blood into me. She asked why I never told her the details, and I said most people don't want to hear about watching your own leg disappear. The next evening, Grace opened up about her ex who'd stolen $40,000 from her over 2 years. He convinced her to add him to her bank accounts, then slowly drained everything while making her think she was bad with money. Her parents had to bail her out financially and watched her have a complete breakdown when she discovered the theft. She said they became protective after seeing her lose everything to someone who claimed to love her. I told her I understood their fear, but it didn't excuse treating me like garbage. 3 days later, I was home alone when someone knocked hard on the door, and I saw Janet through the peephole. She kept knocking and calling out that she just wanted to apologize, but I didn't move from the couch. I texted Grace at work, and she said she was on her way home immediately. Janet stayed outside for 30 minutes, alternating between knocking and sitting on the front steps. When Grace pulled up, I watched through the window as she confronted her mother before Janet could reach the car. Janet tried to hug her, but Grace stepped back and kept 3 feet between them. I could hear Grace saying her mother needed to respect boundaries, and coming here without permission was exactly the problem. Janet started crying and admitted she'd been cruel at dinner, but she was terrified of losing Grace. She said watching Grace with her ex nearly killed her, and she couldn't go through that again. Grace told her that treating me like trash wasn't protecting anyone, and Janet finally admitted she'd been horrible to me. She asked if she could come in to apologize properly, but Grace said not without discussing it with me first. Janet left after 20 more minutes of Grace holding firm on the boundaries we'd established together. The next morning, I went to the police station to file a report about Robert grabbing my prosthetic at dinner. The officer took my statement and said assault charges were possible, but I told him I just wanted documentation. He took photos of the bruises on my residual limb where the socket had twisted when Robert yanked on it. The report took 2 hours to complete with all the details about what Robert and Janet had said and done. I got a case number and copies of everything in case we needed them later for a restraining order. That afternoon, Baxter called saying he'd arranged a tour at an adaptive workplace that specifically hired disabled veterans. The facility had modified workstations and assistive technology for people with different physical limitations. During the tour, I saw a double amputee programming computers with voice recognition software and a blind vet running the reception desk. The manager, who had a prosthetic arm, showed me 3 job openings that matched my skills and said they could start me part-time while I finished vocational training. Seeing other disabled vets working regular jobs and joking around made me realize I'd been isolating myself too much. That evening, Ethan texted inviting us to dinner at his apartment, just the 3 of us without his parents. He said he wanted to talk about what really happened over there and what coming home actually means for people like us. We spent the next hour at Ethan's place talking about what would actually fix things with his parents. I pulled out my phone and started typing a list of what a real apology would need to include. First, they'd have to admit they physically assaulted me when Robert grabbed my prosthetic. Second, they'd need to acknowledge the cruel things they said weren't protective, but abusive. Third, they couldn't make excuses about being worried for Grace. Ethan nodded as I read each point and said he'd talk to them without us having to deal with them directly. Grace's phone buzzed while we were cleaning up the dishes, and her face went white. She showed me the screen where Robert had texted her an ultimatum, saying she had to choose between me or her family. She immediately took a screenshot and started typing back that real families don't force those kinds of choices. Her hands were shaking as she hit send and told him she wouldn't be manipulated like that. The next morning, Grace sat at my kitchen table writing her own letter to her parents. She wrote for 3 hours, crossing things out and starting over until she had 4 pages. The letter explained she wouldn't be forced to choose, but also wouldn't tolerate any more disrespect toward me. She set clear boundaries about when she might consider seeing them again, which was at least a month away. She sealed it in an envelope and drove to their house to leave it in the mailbox without knocking. 2 days later, I had my regular therapy appointment with Sophia at the VA. She had me practice different scenarios for if I ever had to see Robert and Janet again. We role-played me staying calm while she pretended to be Robert making comments about my leg. I practiced my exit strategies, like having Grace's car keys in my pocket and sitting near doors. We went through de-escalation techniques where I'd redirect conversations or simply leave without explaining. Sophia helped me realize I didn't owe them any response to their provocations. The following week, I drove to the adaptive workplace for my real job interview. My palms were sweating as I walked into the conference room where the interviewer was waiting. He had a prosthetic arm and immediately put me at ease by joking about us being the bionic team. He asked about my military experience and how I handled stress, focusing on what I could do rather than my limitations. We talked about the specific job duties, and he showed me the modified workstation they'd set up. I answered his questions about my availability and schedule flexibility around my VA appointments. When he asked about gaps in my employment, I explained my recovery and vocational training without getting defensive. At the end, he shook my hand firmly and said they'd call within a few days. I walked out feeling like I'd actually nailed it despite my nerves. That evening, Grace was scrolling through social media when she suddenly cursed and showed me her phone. Janet had posted some vague status about family challenges and difficult times that made her sound like the victim. Several of their family friends had commented with sympathy and support, not knowing the real story. Grace immediately commented publicly calling out her mother for playing victim after assaulting a disabled veteran. She posted a brief version of what really happened at dinner, and within minutes, Janet deleted the entire post. We sat down that night to figure out how to handle the family gossip without getting sucked into drama. Grace made a list of relatives who'd probably call or text asking questions. We agreed we wouldn't engage with every provocation or spend our energy defending ourselves constantly. She drafted a standard response saying the situation was private and we weren't discussing it. We decided to block certain family members on social media who were known gossips. Grace changed her privacy settings so her parents couldn't see her posts anymore. 3 days later, Ethan called proposing a meeting between all of us at a neutral restaurant. He said his parents were willing to listen if we'd give them one chance to make things right. I told him I needed to discuss it with Sophia first, before agreeing to anything. At my next therapy session, we talked through the pros and cons of meeting them. Sophia helped me see that I could try once, but needed a clear exit plan ready. We agreed on specific boundaries like no physical contact and leaving immediately if they got hostile. The night before the meeting, Grace and I sat at my table preparing what we needed to say. We wrote down our main points on index cards so we wouldn't forget in the heat of the moment. Grace practiced staying calm while I pretended to be her father making excuses. We came up with hand signals for when either of us needed to leave immediately. If I touched my ear, that meant I was done, and we'd leave within 2 minutes. If she squeezed my hand 3 times, same thing. We picked a restaurant near the highway so we could leave quickly if needed. We arrived 15 minutes early to get a table near the exit and have time to settle our nerves. Robert and Janet walked in exactly on time with Ethan behind them, looking stressed. They sat across from us, and Robert immediately started talking about his fears of Grace getting hurt again. He explained how her ex had destroyed her financially and emotionally, leaving them to pick up the pieces. Janet added that they'd watched Grace have a breakdown and couldn't bear seeing it happen again. Neither of them started with an apology, just their own fears and justifications. But at least they were finally listening when Grace explained how their behavior was unacceptable, regardless of their fears. I stayed quiet mostly, just watching their body language and keeping my hand near Grace's in case we needed to leave. Robert shifted in his seat and stared at his hands folded on the table before clearing his throat and looking straight at me. His face had lost all its usual smugness as he admitted that when he grabbed my prosthetic that night, he crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. He said what he did was assault, plain and simple, and while it wasn't a full apology, Hearing him acknowledge the seriousness of his actions made my chest tighten. I pulled out my phone and showed him the photos I'd taken of the bruises on my residual limb from where he'd yanked on my prosthetic, explaining calmly that I had everything documented and could press charges if I wanted to. The color drained from his face as I scrolled through the images, but I told him I was choosing not to file a report as long as he respected my boundaries going forward. I listed them clearly. No physical contact of any kind, no comments about my disability, no filming me without permission, and no speculation about my medical condition or life expectancy. Janet started to say something, but I held up my hand and continued, adding that if they wanted any relationship with Grace, they'd need to treat me with basic human dignity. Grace took over then, her voice steady, as she told her parents she'd consider slowly rebuilding contact if they consistently respected our boundaries for a full month. She wanted to see actions, not just words, and made it clear that any violation would reset the clock or end things permanently. Robert nodded slowly, while Janet twisted her napkin in her lap, both of them looking older than when we'd arrived. We left the restaurant without ordering food, and Grace drove us home in silence while I watched the city lights blur past the window. The next few days were quiet, with no texts or calls from her parents, while Ethan kept us updated that they were processing everything. The silence felt strange after weeks of drama, but it was actually refreshing to wake up without wondering what new crisis would hit. On the fourth day after the meeting, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, it was the HR department from the adaptive workplace I'd interviewed at. They offered me a conditional position pending my background check and medical clearance, starting in 3 weeks with full benefits and accommodations for my disability. Having real employment lined up made my shoulders relax in a way they hadn't in months, knowing I'd have my own income regardless of what happened with Grace's family situation. Grace decided to test the waters by having dinner with just her parents, while I stayed home working on paperwork for the new job. She texted me updates throughout the evening, and after exactly 1 hour, she left when her mother started making subtle digs about how hard it must be for me to find work. Grace walked through my door looking exhausted but proud of herself for maintaining the boundary, showing her parents she was serious about protecting our relationship. 3 days later, a handwritten letter arrived in my mailbox with Robert's return address, and inside was a brief note with no excuses or justifications. He simply wrote that what he did was wrong, that he'd violated my body and dignity, and that he understood if I never wanted to see him again. The letter went into a folder I'd started keeping of important documents, something to discuss with Sophia at my next session. During therapy that week, Sophia and I talked through the difference between forgiveness and allowing people access to your life. She helped me see that I could work toward forgiving Robert and Janet for my own peace, while still maintaining strict boundaries about when and how they could be part of our lives. We practiced different scenarios and responses, and I left feeling clearer about my own limits and needs. 2 weeks passed before Grace suggested trying a public brunch with both her parents at a busy restaurant downtown. We chose a place with multiple exits and agreed to stay for 90 minutes maximum, with both of us ready to leave if things went south. Robert and Janet arrived 5 minutes early and chose a table in the middle of the room, away from walls where I might feel trapped. The conversation stayed surface level, discussing the weather and local news, with a few awkward pauses, but no cruel comments or attempts at physical contact. Janet asked about my new job and managed to sound genuinely interested when I described the adaptive technology I'd be working with. Robert kept his hands folded in his lap the entire time, clearly conscious of not reaching toward me or making any sudden movements. When our time was up, we said polite goodbyes, and Grace and I walked to our car feeling cautiously optimistic about the possibility of managed contact. Ethan was waiting by my apartment when we got home, his face drawn and tired looking. He admitted he'd been having nightmares about the IED blast since seeing me at his parents' house, reliving the explosion and the aftermath every night. His hands shook as he described waking up in cold sweats, hearing the ringing in his ears and smelling the burning metal and flesh that haunted both our memories. We sat on my couch for 2 hours, comparing our experiences and trauma responses, finding comfort in shared understanding of things most people couldn't imagine. Before he left, we made plans to attend a VA family counseling session together the following week, hoping that processing our shared trauma might help us both move forward. The next morning, Janet called Grace while I was in the shower, and I could hear Grace's raised voice through the bathroom door. Grace paced our living room with her phone pressed to her ear, shaking her head at whatever her mother was saying. When I came out toweling my hair, Grace held up her hand to show she needed another minute. She finally said, "No, absolutely not," and hung up the phone before throwing it onto the couch. Janet had tried to set conditions for future family gatherings, wanting me to promise I'd try harder to fit in with them. Grace called her mother back immediately and told her I didn't need to earn basic respect from anyone. My first day at the adaptive technology company arrived 2 days later, and I woke up at 5 in the morning too nervous to sleep. The commute took 45 minutes on the accessible bus route, and my prosthetic was already rubbing wrong by the time I arrived. The office had automatic doors and wide hallways that made navigation easy with my cane. My supervisor showed me to a desk that could adjust height and had a special cushion for managing pain. The computer setup included voice commands and other adaptive features I'd never seen before. By lunch, my lower back was screaming from sitting differently than I had in months. I took my pain medication in the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face. The afternoon involved learning 3 different software programs, while my phantom pain flared up every 20 minutes. My coworkers invited me to join them for coffee breaks, but I needed those times to stretch and adjust my prosthetic. By the end of the first week, I'd proven I could handle the workload despite the physical challenges. The chronic pain required constant management, but I was contributing something meaningful again. That Friday evening, I found a voicemail from Robert on my phone that I'd missed during work. His voice sounded different, quieter and less confident than I'd ever heard it before. He explained that his father had been disabled from a construction accident when Robert was 15. He'd spent years helping with caregiving while watching his mother burn out from the stress. Seeing me had triggered all those memories of helplessness and anger from that time. He acknowledged it wasn't an excuse for his behavior, but wanted me to understand where it came from. I deleted the message without responding, but mentioned it to Grace when she got home. That weekend, Grace and I sat at our kitchen table with cups of coffee getting cold between us. She brought up the timeline we'd discussed for moving in together permanently and suggested we slow things down. We needed to be sure we were choosing each other for the right reasons, not just bonding over trauma. The conversation lasted 3 hours as we talked through our fears about the future. Grace worried she was rebelling against her parents by being with me, rather than genuinely choosing our relationship. I admitted I sometimes wondered if she stayed out of pity or guilt about what happened. We decided to keep our separate places for at least 6 more months while we figured things out. 2 weeks later, Robert texted asking if he could pay for a replacement cane since Janet had thrown mine away. I agreed to meet him at a medical supply store downtown on a Tuesday afternoon. He arrived 10 minutes early and waited by the entrance without trying to help me out of my Uber. Inside the store, he stayed quiet while the specialist measured me and discussed different options. Robert kept his hands in his pockets the entire time and stepped back whenever I moved. He paid for the custom carbon fiber cane without commenting on the price. We walked to our cars without speaking, but he nodded once before driving away. Janet started changing her social media habits around the same time, removing old posts about family. Grace noticed her mother had deleted several passive-aggressive memes about ungrateful children. Janet sent Grace occasional texts about neutral topics like recipes or TV shows, without mentioning me at all. These small changes felt like progress, even though we weren't directly communicating. 3 months had passed since that horrible dinner, when I realized my body had finally started to relax. My shoulders weren't constantly tensed when Grace mentioned her parents in conversation. My hands stayed steady even when her phone rang with their ringtone. I could choose when to engage with information about them rather than just reacting from fear. The phantom pain still flared up, but it wasn't triggered by anxiety about Robert and Janet anymore. Ethan invited us to a barbecue at his apartment on a Saturday when the weather turned warm. He mentioned his parents would be there but promised to keep things casual and respectful. Grace and I discussed it for several days before agreeing to try for 2 hours maximum. We arrived to find Robert manning the grill while Janet arranged food on a picnic table. Everyone nodded politely, but nobody attempted hugs or handshakes or forced conversation. The afternoon stayed surface level with discussions about sports and the weather and Ethan's new promotion. Robert asked if I wanted a burger without making assumptions about what I could handle. Janet passed me the potato salad without commentary about my ability to serve myself. When our 2 hours were up, we made polite excuses about other plans and left without drama. Ethan walked us to our car and thanked us for trying, understanding this would never be easy. Grace held my hand during the drive home, and we both knew we'd found a way to coexist. Her parents would never be family to me, but we could share space when necessary for Grace and Ethan. The boundaries were firm and respected, and that was enough for now. Thanks for letting me wander through all this with you. Definitely been quite a journey to share together. Really appreciate you being here. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.